Yeah.
Clinical registries can provide profound insights into disease patterns and treatment effectiveness, and ultimately improve patient outcomes. New technology, including AI, enables faster and better data collection and analysis. Today's guest, Matt Hollingsworth, is co founder and CEO of Carta Healthcare, which fuses technology, data, and human expertise in a quest to radically improve outcomes. Investors and customers are lining up. Are they on to something big? Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the Health Biz Podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. If you like this show, please subscribe and leave a review. Matt, welcome to the Health Biz Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, we're going to talk all about what you're doing now and all sorts of exciting questions that you're addressing. I want to roll the clock back a little bit and talk about your background, your upbringing. What was your childhood like? Any childhood influences that have stuck with you in your career?
Oh, that's a great question. The biggest one is that my mom has had 5 forms of cancer. I was actually the first one was when she was pregnant with me, so it started even before I was born. It was breast cancer, and so I got to be part of the health system from a very early age, hanging out with my mom while she was going to sort of endless appointments throughout my life, and so that eventually is what sort of brought me to what the company is today. But and my dad, he works in IT generally and taught me pretty much everything I know about computers generally, and so that's my mom and my
Yeah.
dad's story kind of combined to be what was eventually Carta. So yeah,
That
that's a
sounds
good
good. I
question.
mean, imagine if you'd had 4 or 5 parents, what you could have achieved. So,
Yeah,
so that's pretty good.
yeah.
Now, with your mom's, healthcare side, normally as a kid or even as a patient or a friend of a patient, you just go to the hospital, the doctor. You just like assume they know what they're doing and they have all the information available. Did you have a sense at any point that that wasn't 100% the case? That there was some potential that was left on the table?
Yeah, so I don't think I really realized that until the fifth cancer, actually, because that was the first one where I was an adult and I had a lot more involvement in like going actually to appointments and being there. Because before I would be left with someone sort of outside the doctor's
Yeah.
office and I had no idea what was going on inside. But specifically, what one thing I kept seeing happening, which was eventually became the inspiration for me going down this path in the first place. So my mom has an extremely complicated medical history, and she carries this binder around that's very long of everything that's happened to her. She's had 31 surgeries and has this whole cocktail of drugs keeping her alive. Like one of the cancers is thyroid. So she has hormone replacement, which interacts with everything under the sun. And so it's
Yeah.
like stuff that you have to know if you don't want to kill her. So every time that she would go to a new care team, they do the intake process, and they kept doing it and then turning around and typing it into the EHR, and it takes half an hour. So it was like a memorable thing for me, and they kept doing it. As I was just wondering, like, what's this EHR thing doing? If it's not like this is changing, so what's this for? And
Yeah.
that question sort of, I started digging and found out the whole thing was really complicated, and decided if I wanted to make any difference, I needed to sort of study it, and so I ended up going to business school to focus in healthcare operations. So that's sort of, and then it eventually became Carta.
Got it. I think what happens, it sounds like you were going to the diligent doctors that took it and, put all the information in. A lot of times what you see is that there'll be a big list, in fact, whether paper or electronic, and they'll say, just tell me what's what. Just tell me what I need to know, as opposed, which is difficult for the patient, of course, to do and not really their, shouldn't really be their job. So you
Yeah, I
just
mean, and
told,
that's part of the reason why this was so impressive to me, because my mom's a very organized person, and so she spent this time. So they kind of didn't have an option but to listen to everything. She'd just
yeah,
start reading through the document, right? But not
yeah,
everyone does that, and I mean, I think that's part of the reason why she had such great outcomes. I mean, she's had 5 cancers and she's still around, and plus
yeah.
the care teams were wonderful. So that, like on the other side of the spectrum, there are problems, but obviously the system works very well in some capacities because my mom's still around, and so I both sort of appreciate it and feel like there are things that could be improved. More both dimensions more than your average person, I think, just because of
So,
what's happened.
so you mentioned the business school side. What did you do before business school in terms of education?
Yeah, so actually, I started my career as a high energy physicist. Spent 6 years in a lab called CERN in Switzerland, part of the team there that found a particle called the Higgs boson, and then basically spent the rest of my career doing AI engineering.
Yeah.
Turns out actually doing high energy physics is very similar to a big data science project because it's mostly data mining. Like it so happened when I was there, I got to be part of building the detector, which was awesome. So I got there right before the particle accelerator turned on, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But it was really great education in data science, which I decided to apply to other industries afterwards. So
That's
yeah.
that sounds good. Well, I saw a few things on your LinkedIn. SOAR technology, global
Hmm.
dressage and analytics. Is that the
Yep.
pronunciation?
Yeah.
Deep
Yeah.
Deep Field and Samsung. So maybe kind of lead me through that progression, such as it is.
Absolutely. So Global Dressage Analytics was a company that I was on the founding team for that I started with a friend of mine from CERN, actually, a professor there. The idea there, so his wife is a dressage coach. And so they have a place where they teach other, mostly kids, how to do dressage, and they also host competitions. And so we figured out that we could analyze the scores and predict how they would perform at a particular competition, and also what needed to be trained. And so we sold that to the folks who ride the horses that compete in the competitions. It's still
Sounds
around.
good. I was
Really
going to
cool.
say we have a fairly educated healthcare audience here, but not everyone knows that dressage has something to do with horses. So
Yes, it's horse dancing basically,
yeah,
which is the short summary. That's really
yeah,
interesting. But anyway, applied data science in this case for sports coaching. Sortech is about applying that to the defense industry essentially, so trying to find ways to help make that more effective. Deep Field was about doing it for telecom analytics. So there's a common theme here, basically.
yeah,
Things that everybody knows what Samsung does. So
yeah.
um,
They make
yeah,
the smart refrigerators, right? That's going to tell me either it's going to tell me I need some new celery, and it's going to tell the Chinese what I'm doing.
exactly.
Yeah,
That's
sounds good.
right.
All right, let's talk about Carta Healthcare, and which has less to do with horses. Is that fair?
Much less to do with
Yeah.
horses. That's fair.
So what was
Yeah.
the what I got sort of like the deep origins of the company, but like how did this company actually come to life? Why this new company? And obviously Samsung's a huge company, and you go from that to a startup.
Yeah. Okay. So it began actually, I wasn't really setting out to create a new company. So all this began when I went to business school. I also joined a research group that's called SURF, which is the Healthcare Operations Research Group at Stanford. And the easiest way to describe what they do is to talk about the first paper that I published there, which was a paper on these things called preference cards, which is basically the list of things that you bring into an operating room before a procedure starts. We had the idea that we could predict what more accurately what should be brought into the room beforehand than what the current state of the preference cards, and then use that prediction to update the preference cards so that you don't waste as much stuff. Because the whole point, like, I don't know if you've ever seen surgery in the OR, but they bring this huge tray in, and then about 80% of it they just throw straight into the trash at the end
Yeah,
of
yeah,
it.
yeah.
So our thought was less trash, less waste, money savings, and then just things not being thrown away. And so, long story short, we saved about $5 million a year. This is for Stanford Children's,
Nice.
doing that project, which was really interesting. And then went on to do some other things. Like the other projects are all fit that mold. It's like
Now
collect a data set, predict something, and improve operations.
now
Basically,
it's an interesting thing. Let's I know we defined dressage, which is not a healthcare thing, but uh, preference in the context of healthcare. What does that mean? Preference.
so the preference cards are a combination of two things. They're what to bring into the room to prepare for a particular procedure, and also how to set the room up. So it's basically the instructions for the team to get it ready for the surgeon to do their work. So that's why the preference part is there.
Yeah,
It's like sort of up to the surgeon's preferences on how they want things to be set up. So basically, the part we were talking about is just the supply section of that. There's actually a lot more to it that also
yeah,
could be improved in many cases, but that was the thing that we focused on. So really, the thing to think about is like a pick list or like a to do list. Like this is the list of
yeah.
things that I want in the room is
Yeah.
part that we
And I guess I was focusing on the preference aspect because it really is about like, this is like the old school medicine. Like, what does a surgeon want? We put it there. It's not really evidence based. So typically you
That's right.
might have something. I'd heard about this, I think from my brother who was in training at the Brigham in Boston. And he'd said, like we order all this blood and like all these things that are needed. And guess what happens to that? It's not usually needed. And so there's not that feedback loop necessarily, except that the surgeon still wants it, right? That's the feedback.
Yep. That's right. And in
So,
fact, you predicted one of the other, like I was sort of referencing a bunch of other projects that we did. One of the other ones was doing an analysis, a sort of value based analysis to understand what is an ideal setup of orthopedic supplies, because there are tons of vendors, and if you can consolidate, you can get cost savings. But does that have a quality downside versus a cost upside and all this sort of stuff? Because absolutely right. Like for the most part, hospitals want to serve surgeons, and I think that's the right way to do it. Like you
Yeah.
want to make sure that they're happy and that they have exactly what they need to be the best that they can be. But if you can help sort of shine light on what is a good choice versus a bad choice there on the financial side, then in many cases you'll find that the surgeon's like, oh well, I mean, I have like a
Yeah.
0.1% preference on that, but if it costs half as much, whatever, I'll use that too. That's perfectly fine. So
Even just
just being able
culturally,
to call those out is perfect.
even I think just culturally, people would, there might have been somebody who made the observation that maybe it's like a resident or a nurse or somebody that would notice that, that stuff's never used. But then I think if you actually go and they may be afraid to tell the surgeon that, or they don't realize that that's like $500,000 worth of
Uh,
something that's getting tossed.
exactly, that second is a huge effect, because like no one knows how much these things cost, right? Like they have this stuff sitting on a tray, and there can be a $15,000 item right next to something that's 5 cents, and they look
Yeah.
the same, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody, I mean, they just throw things away, and if you just point and it's like, yo, that's $15,000, they're like, what? Like, I mean, a
Yeah.
lot of that savings came in the form of those, where there was some item that was multiple thousands of dollars that was just being thrown away just because nobody had taken the time to update the list of stuff they're bringing in, and they would have if they would have known it was that expensive. So just sort of surfacing this information to the right people at the right time is the way to fix that. Like making the decision for them. Like one thing this AI did not do, it did not just update them willy
Yeah.
nilly. And in fact, this is a theme that will come back in the company later. We gave recommendations to the lead nurse that was overseeing this, but recommendations, like just pointing
Yeah.
out, hey, you've never used this. And they're like, oh, yeah, we never use this. What's this doing here? And
Yeah.
like, just let's get it off. Or you always use this and it's not on. And you're like, oh, yeah, I have to run out in the middle of a procedure every single time to get
Yeah.
this because it's never. So that sort of recommendation to a subject matter expert that can then turn that into something that is a good thing. Because sometimes the recommendations are wrong. Like maybe they just don't document that because it's so small, nobody cares about it. But it's one of those things where like giving them a recommendation and allowing a subject matter expert to decide is the right path. Just like almost every application of AI is out there. So
Sounds good. All right. Well, I got you out of your childhood and I think out of Europe and now back over towards Stanford, but you're still in your research phase. Okay. So the company
yes,
Carta Healthcare. So you weren't planning to
yes,
start a company, but you did anyway.
yes, exactly. So we did more projects like that, and I think if you were to take someone off the street and ask like what's hard in that story, they would say, oh, the predicted, like building this fancy predictive model that's in the middle of that, and that's just not true. And the easiest way to describe that is to look at the timeline for how that project came to be, or any of the other ones, and the relative ratios are the same, but the project length may vary, but the ratios are the same. 18 months of data collection, which looked like a bunch of nurses typing into this thing that's called RegCap, which is basically like sort of HIPAA compliant Excel for a data capture program. About 3 days for me to build the model. It was a
Yeah.
weekend. And then about 6 weeks of change management. So it spit out a whole bunch of recommendations, and then we fed them to the lead nurse, who then went and enacted them. That process took about 6 weeks. So the vast majority of that time was in data collection. All the other projects, same exact thing. Like the ratio was the same. And so at some point I was like, well, maybe we should be working on that part, because we'd be able to
Yeah.
do literally 20 times more QI projects with the same budget if we didn't have to rely on nurses to go out and manually collect all this data. So let me see if I can replicate the results of those projects. So like get the same model output, but instead of having someone manually curate it, use AI to pull the data instead. And since we're sitting here, like, long story short, that worked. And it worked really well. And I was demonstrating it to one of the clinicians that was involved in one of the other papers that I didn't talk about. But anyway, he said, oh, you built an AI assisted data abstraction system, which I had no idea what he was talking about until he introduced us to this whole group of people. There are 120 of them. This was affiliated with Stanford Children's. So at Stanford Children's, 120 people whose sole purpose at Stanford Children's is to sit there and fill out forms for either quality reporting or research purposes. And
Yeah.
that's what they do all day. And he's like, so this is basically the same thing. So maybe this will work. And this is a problem that every hospital has. Like thus far, we'd worked on research projects because that's what I was working on. But these other things, the quality documentation part, they're these things called registries that every hospital has to submit to if they want to be accredited for different stuff. And so it's a problem that every hospital has. And so that's the thing that like is a lot more interesting from a scalability perspective, because thus far this was an academic exercise. And so what we did is we thought, okay, well, maybe this will work. We tried a prototype. It looked like it worked. And then we got a grant from the American College of Cardiology to try this for real for a couple of their registries. And lo and behold, it worked very well. They ended up investing, and then we raised around, and that's where Carta began. But
So
yeah.
let me ask you about that. Okay, so we have another word there, abstraction, right? It's sort of like, well, we're going to do something specific. It just sounds kind of abstract. It sounds more like the collider or something. Like what's abstract about looking at the record?
Well,
I
I'm
guess
glad you asked. So
it says
it's
a
a
verb, I
weird
guess.
name.
But yeah,
I think people gave it that name because data entry is too simple for what it is. It's
yeah,
a skilled data entry problem, basically. Where
okay,
so it's referred to like the sort of I think a better term of art for this is swivel chair analytics, where like you have the electronic health record open on one side with all of its notes and unstructured data and mess, and then you
yeah,
have a form on another screen where you swivel over and fill it out. So you read, and was the patient hypertensive upon admission, and then you go to the form, find that field and say yes or no, and then you go to the next field and go back and forth. So that's what they're doing. And the key is though, like I couldn't do that. Like I don't
yeah,
have enough clinical expertise to do it. At this point, I might be able to do some of them, but for the most part, not. I'm not a clinician. I
yeah,
can't make clinical calls. I can't fill those things out accurately. But nurses and physicians can, and it has to be them. So it's not something where you can just hire somebody off the street and like fill out the form. It's not robotic. You're not like going to some place that has an answer over here and putting it into the right place over there. You're actually reading through stuff, interpreting it, and filling out a form on the other end. So it's
got it.
data abstraction equals skilled data entry is what I would say. But to give a little perspective here, like these forms that I don't think there's a word in the English language to describe what these things look like.
Yeah,
Form, I mean, that sounds like something you do at the DMV in like 10 minutes
right.
or whatever. That is not what this is. So just for perspective here, the one registry, one of these forms that needs to be completed is called cath PCI. And that happens when a PCI is performed in the cath lab. So the form takes about an hour and a half to complete, which is often longer than the actual
Yeah,
procedure takes. So it's like more work. It was just ridiculous, but that's how it is. So like this is not a DMD form. It takes a long time, and a lot of expertise gets dumped into doing this.
yeah,
So I think that's why people came up with another word for it. It just data entry. People get the wrong impression. It's
got it.
something totally different.
Okay, so at the risk of taking us further afield, so if you think about someone's in the cath lab, they're doing PCI, they're documenting it, and yet when it comes to doing your registry, not from your mom's binder, mind you, from the modern electronic medical record that somebody spent hundreds of millions of dollars on for a single instance probably at Stanford, at least that's what they spend in Boston. I don't know how much they spend at Stanford. You still have to have it, right? It's why if they were doing a PCI, presumably in a quality way with a protocol, and they document it in the EHR, why does it need to be abstracted for the quality registry?
That's a great question. So the way it gets documented is a way that makes sense to clinicians, which is our long form notes, like English clinical terminology that gets in there, and it needs to be turned from that into a form with structured data in it. So it's this unstructured to structured thing that is the data abstraction problem, and EHRs don't solve that problem because so first off, let's imagine the way it's done in real life is you have a team that does this on the back end, but also the nurses on the front end could do it, right? Like they have the skills to do it. Why isn't that the case? Well, that's because then they'd have to spend an hour and a half after a case filling out these fields. Like the content that is in notes that are typed or dictated is a lot more rich and takes a lot less time for humans to dump, just because that's the way that we think, to
Yeah,
dump into the EHR than clicking a series of order of magnitude 350 check boxes and text boxes. Like that just takes way longer. So the EHRs can provide the text boxes, but the problem is someone needs to fill them out, and so
yeah,
that's the key. And you have to transform it into the narrative that's either in your brain or more often than not on a note that you're reading. Like if you're doing it in the room, in principle, it's in your brain, but you
yeah.
still have to go through and fill all that out for an hour. Like it's not. So
Okay,
anyway, that's the problem. You have to actually fill the thing out. So, and there are hundreds of these fields, so it would just add a huge amount of documentation burden, and it doesn't really matter if it's in the back end or the front end per
got it.
se, because you still have to spend the same amount of time.
Okay.
So that's the reason it's difficult.
All right, so you had to start with the problem of abstraction. It's not done very well now. The cardiac folks saw you could do it better, hence then they wanted to invest, hence the company. So
Pretty much.
so you're not the only one that does abstraction. So there's a lot of, every hospital and department has it, and some have it more centralized than others, and some of it's people that are dedicated, and some it's part of their time and all that. And there's companies that serve that. But why? What makes you different? What makes you better?
Yeah, great question. So there's several aspects of that. Let me first start on the technology front, because that's, I think, one of the more interesting ones here. We're not the first people to think about using natural language processing to do this work. Not anywhere close. We won't be the last either. Okay, so just an easy way to prove that, if you go to Google Scholar and type in AI data abstraction, you'll find thousands of papers. Like, people have
Yeah.
done this. And just to save you time, like, the way these papers look, the abstract will be like, okay, we decided to use natural language processing to figure out 10 clinical concepts. Was the patient hypertensive upon admission? Are they diabetic? Blah, blah, blah. So 10. And the method is that they will then go build an AI model and try to replicate a gold standard data set that was abstracted by humans
Right.
to create it. So they'll go out and collect 500 cases or whatever of those 10 concepts, try to replicate it, and then publish an F score, some sort of accuracy metric on the other end. And on average, what you'll find, 7 out of the 10 can be replicated, 3 can't. And then they'll say something about, like, oh, maybe if whatever 2 of these would work or whatever, but the 10th one's just too hard, blah, blah. That's a summary of all those papers. And again, there's thousands of them. So people have been doing it for a long time.
Yeah.
So that begs the question, like, why isn't this out there? Right.
Yeah.
Like,
well, you saved me a lot of time reading all the literature. So that was a quick summary. And anybody who's listened to the podcast on 2X, they heard it in 10 seconds instead of 20.
Exactly.
So that's pretty impressive.
Yes. So like, the main point there, we're definitely not the first people to think about this, and not even the first people to succeed at doing some of it. The problem, though, is when you look at the unit economics of this, because, so just imagine that paper for a second. Okay, first off, let me give one more detail here that's going to be important. The way this works is you do it, like, at Stanford, or maybe at, like, a few sites somewhere.
Yeah.
Problem is that the model that you built at Stanford will not perfectly translate without modification to another place. But the issue is you don't know which ones work or don't until you validate it, which looks, again, exactly like data abstraction. Like, you have to build a gold standard data set and blah, blah, blah. So the problem is, when you look at the economics of that class of deployment, it doesn't work. So what will happen is you have to go out, and if you're just sort of building a spreadsheet of this, the cost is in the gold standard collection to do validation or training, depending on if you're building it or validating in a new site, but it's the same exercise. You have to go out and get many cases and then check it to see how it performs. So that's the cost. And then the benefit is that you can save that labor in the future for whichever ones work. So then the math question is, how much investment does it take to do the validation and rollout versus how much time gets saved over time? And then if you're building a business out of it, how much you're going to get paid for that? If you do out the math, you're upside down from a net present value sort of calculation, or like a enterprise value calculation. You have to invest too much for the cash flows that you get over time to work. So the business just doesn't work. And it's not because people haven't tried it. It just doesn't work. So, and on the client side, it's even worse, because you can't add any value until all of that is done. And it takes years. Like, if you need several hundred cases, some of these registries don't have volumes that exceed that. So you have to wait several years. And so if you purchase this and you don't get any value for years, and that's why these things haven't worked. People have done it academically, but you can't actually get ROI out of it because of just the way that the math works. So what we figured out is that we can go and be risk bearing. So the whole purpose of this is to save money and time at the end of the day. So if we can take, like, say that today, Insert Hospital here is spending $100 for a form, and we come in and say, hey, we'll do that for 60, which is sort of the same benefit that you would expect when you sort of add the software cost and subtract the time savings and whatever. Like, if you built this yourself, asymptotically, that's what you would approach. We'll just offer it to you now. Like, we can do it now.
Yeah.
And then our goal is to evolve a manual process into a thing that allows us to substantiate that price point. And we can do it over time in ways that institutions or other companies that are trying to build this stuff can't. The key, though, is on the product front. What you need to do to make this evolve is the system actually needs to learn from the abstraction team over time, so that when they come in day zero, they're doing it manually. When they come in day 30, it's saving them time. When they come in day 60, it's saving them more time, that sort of thing. So on the product front, what we did here is we added a learning component to it that allows it to feedback and actually learn from the abstractors, which has a lot of interesting ramifications in terms of the way that we can deliver the product and things like that. But that's what's different. We figured out a way to make this learn and improve over time, which makes all the unit economics work out on both sides. The client gets the savings immediately. We can substantiate the savings because we can have a lower labor base over time, and it works out really well. So that's sort of the core of this is that we figured out a way to repackage all of this in a risk bearing sort of mechanism for clients, and B, we figured out a product way to actually make that work on the business side. So
Got it. All
yeah.
right. So when we were talking, what I'm hearing about, hospitals and providers as customers, and they're doing the abstraction for things like these quality registries for the medical society. So that's one side of it. There's also registries that are done, say, in the pharma industry that are either
Mm-hmm.
done post-approval for safety requirements or, to gather real-world evidence. And I was thinking about that because as you were describing the challenge of this data abstraction, pharma certainly has deeper pockets than some of the providers, and they've spent a lot of money on real world evidence, but a lot of the companies doing real world evidence don't make any money because it costs them too much to do the abstraction. Do you play in that? Am I right? And do you play in that as well?
You're absolutely right, and that is absolutely something we could do. The only reason we're not doing it now is just focus. Like we picked
Yeah.
the registry stuff because it's a problem that we understood. We will definitely be doing that at some point in the company's trajectory. Same exact problem as you mentioned, different sales sort of
Yeah.
strategy and cycle and all that sort of stuff. So because that's different, and we wanted to focus, that's the only reason we picked it. But you're right, it's exactly the same problem. In fact, there's all sorts of things that are like that, like all the risk adjustment things,
Yeah.
just clinical trial recruiting, same story. Like you have to go out and figure out who's in and who's out. Just so many things that are out there
Yeah.
that are a data abstraction
Well,
problem.
what's fun about healthcare from a business standpoint, is that there's a lot of multi-billion-dollar niches, and so you don't have to do
Mm-hmm.
everything in order to have a decent-sized company. All right, so
Yeah.
you talked about how one of the things that makes what you do special is that it can learn as it goes. There's
Mm-hmm.
also this concept within healthcare AI. Maybe it requires more human involvement in training than maybe, let's say, for financial services or some other areas. Is that right? And if so, why?
Yes, and it's just so much more the data is way more complicated. Like financial services, at the end of the day, you have transactions that go from point A to point B and prices. Like that's basically what you need to communicate in some form or another. So it's really really easy to make standards. For this, like the standards, even the standards themselves have millions of concepts, millions. Like no human actually really understands any of those codings. Like no one can remember a million
Yeah.
concepts. So it's just way harder. And there's no enforced standard for doing this because again, like if we forced everyone to, like one of the standards is called SNOMED. If we forced everyone to document everything in
Yeah.
SNOMED to the point where it would fill out the registries, like everyone would just be spending like a single patient would be 8 hours of work, and
Yeah.
it's just not feasible. So people don't there because of that. There's no real accepted standard because not everyone can afford to throw an army of people at documentation. Like AMCs can afford more than the sort of
Yeah.
regional ones can often, and like so. Anyway,
Yeah.
point is there's no
So
standard, so it's hard.
AMC's being the academic medical centers as opposed to the
Yes,
theater, and SNOMED is like, I think there's an expression here. It wouldn't stand a SNOMED's chance in hell of succeeding, right, as you described. So all right.
that's right.
So
Yeah.
so so healthcare is such a big mess, and while I'm a proponent of technology and change and so on, I wonder, do you think AI can actually make a meaningful difference in healthcare? There've been a lot of things that have been tried, haven't been so successful.
Yes, it can, and I think people ought to. Okay, so I think there's been a lot of over promising and under delivering in that general umbrella, which I find very, very sad. And also, I think has added a lot of skepticism, which makes it harder to get stuff done that actually can work.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the bar should be that people like basically every application that I've seen, you could figure out a way to make the contract risk bearing. It's just the problem is people have come like big, very well funded companies have come along and been like, yeah, pay us $3 million a year for AI, and like sort of give nominal ROI, and that this will revolutionize everything, and then it doesn't, and everyone's disappointed, and they're stuck putting a $3 million a year bill for 5 years or whatever, and it doesn't go anywhere you can just sit down and be like, okay, this is an actual thing that this can do, and I'm so sure about it that I'll bear the risk on it and figure out a way to do it. Because so much of AI is about sort of freeing up mundane labor stuff that you can tie it to labor rates eventually. And so, just anyway, I think one of the biggest problems is the engagement models in these cases, that you need 2 years before you're adding value, that like the company isn't actually bearing any of the risk of the engagement, all these sort of things. And the second bit is I think people need to quit trying to remove subject matter experts from the loop. Like that just never works. I mean, I've been doing AI for my whole career. There's never a case where AI is completely removes the subject matter expert from the loop. Like that's just sort of a truism that if you peel back the curtains on how this stuff is working, it it just doesn't like the only times where you could make an argument that that's true is where the user is the subject matter expert, like Google, for instance,
Yeah.
where like but again, like it's not, you don't click Google and say, give me what I want. And it just pops up a web page. Like I'm feeling lucky that no one ever uses it around. Used to have that,
Yeah.
but like no one uses it because it doesn't work. Like
Yeah.
you get a list and then you read through it and you're like, okay, because you're the subject matter expert in that case, right? So like just I think this idea that this is going to put tons of people out of jobs and all this sort of stuff is just not true. You can make them more productive is just another productivity tool. So
Yeah.
people would quit trying to like promising that and then not delivering it. People would just quit doing that, and if also people would quit buying that because it can't be done, then I think there's a ton of value that can be added. It's just a matter of making sure that we do the right stuff with it.
So I'm fairly optimistic that, companies like yours are going to solve these problems like on a B2B basis, put the right business model in place, the right incentives, the acknowledgement of the experts, the need for people, and so on, and that it can actually address in a meaningful way some of the problems we have, which is,
Mm-hmm.
chronic lack of staff, burnout, et cetera, and that would be good. The part I'm less actually certain about and sometimes a little surprised about is that there's a lot of patient skepticism and even hostility to the use in AI in medicine. Now, if you ask people, like, are they comfortable using it here or there? Now, granted, we don't expect people to actually completely understand it. And yet at the same time, it is important. And you say, hey, I don't want any AI in my healthcare. How do you think about that? And where do we go from there?
That's a great question. And so we actually did a survey relatively recently. One of the questions that was asked there was how, basically, do you think that your doctor uses AI in your care delivery? And about 50% of the people thought yes, and 50% thought no, which is interesting because that is objectively 100% of people use AI. Like, for instance, my favorite example of this is a pulse oximeter. Like, it
Yeah,
uses AI algorithms to do peak detection,
right.
and like there's a Kalman filter to filter out noise, and like it's AI. It's just turned into a hardware package.
Yeah,
But we have a great solution to make sure that that doesn't screw things up, which is the clinical trial, just like everything
yeah,
else. And I get like drugs are way scarier than AI, any form of AI. I mean, it's software, like it's not actually in your body. So
yeah,
it's one of those things where like we have a solution for that. We just need to stick to it. Like if it passes the clinical trial, you should trust it just as much as you trust anything else that passed a clinical trial if it's actually touching you. And if it's administrative stuff, I don't think the patients care about that one way or the other. Like,
yeah,
I mean, unless they get a random bill or something like that, but then they care
yeah,
about the bill that gets addressed later, right? So like for the actual care part, like I definitely don't think any AI should be touching patients unless it's been gone through a clinical trial.
yeah,
Absolutely. And you should be terrified of anything that like because anybody who's that non-disciplined, like anyway, you should be terrified of that. But if it's
yeah,
been through a clinical trial, it's just like another thing out there. It's no different than a device or a drug. So as long as we trust our clinical trial system, which I think we have a very trustworthy clinical trial system for the most part, then everything should be fine. But I think what people are pushing back against is this idea that they're going to be talking to a robot,
yeah,
which is legit. Like, I don't want to do that either. Like, I don't trust. I mean, I believe a lot in what AI could do, and I would never trust some sort of AI system to go out and diagnose me and do whatever. So I think people are pushing back on that, which is a completely legitimate thing.
yeah,
So just, I mean, I think the main point here is I don't think we need to worry about AI in a different class than we do devices
yeah.
or drugs. It's just a new thing that we need to make sure we have controls over, and we have an extremely powerful control mechanism that we shouldn't relax for any AI sort of application.
Sounds good. All right, so let's look ahead a little bit. I've dragged you back into the past a few times, but how do you see things evolving or accelerating or becoming revolutionary over the next time frame, whatever your time frame is, a year, 5 years, whatever the horizon is?
I mean, I think the fact that there is a lot of, I mean, during my career, there have been, I don't know, at least two other big hype cycles like this. Like there was the the speech to text version, then there was the image recognition
Yeah,
version, and now there's the generative AI version. Like each time we get boost, the thing that's different about this one is I think it's something everyone can interact with and understand, which is I think ChatGPT is probably will go down in history as the first time that the average person on the street interacted with AI directly and felt like they were understood what was going on. Like people
yeah,
don't think of Google as AI, even though it is just completely smothered in it, like more than
yeah,
almost any other product that's out there. But they're just like, oh, it's just a search box, right? Like they don't think about it in the way that people sort of think of AI. But I think everyone thinks of ChatGPT that way. So now there's like headspace in everybody's mind about what AI is and what could be cool about it and what's scary about it and all this sort of stuff, which I think is net very good. Like first off, it's going to keep people from using it for reasons that aren't, kosher, like, diagnosing a patient without going through a clinical trial sort of thing
yeah,
in our space. But also it will help provide just excitement about it. People wanting to learn about how it works, and it's not magic; it's math. And so, like, everyone could learn how it works and learn how to apply it. And I think there will be a lot of interest for it, and a sort of necessary thing eventually. Like, just I think the excitement will overpower the skepticism to where
yeah.
people will sit down and be like, maybe software as a service is not the right way to deliver this, and start coming out with models that will actually work and business engagements that will actually work. So I'm very optimistic about where this goes. I think people have been burned enough with sort of blind application of SaaS models to AI in ways that don't work. Um, and over time, we'll get more companies that are really good at taking this stuff and applying it in ways that guarantee value and create a lot of value. So I think the next step of this is going to be like, I guess, to bottom line here, I don't think that the technology even needs to evolve very much for any of this to
Yeah.
be true. It is evolving, but I think what's going to evolve is people's understanding of how to apply it, both in terms of turning it into businesses, but also how to like turn it into value for people at the end of the day, just because the population of people who understand it is exponentially increasing right now, which is really awesome. I think it's going to be great for everybody.
Great. So, Matt, my last question for you is whether you've read any good books lately, and is anything you would recommend, or anything you'd recommend to avoid?
That's a good question. I Yes, I want to give a good recommendation here because I've been talking too much and I'm blanking on the most recent one that I read that is
I
um,
say sometimes I can never remember the name of the books I'm reading. I'll say it's
that,
yeah, it's the one with the blue color cover that has the white squiggly on it. So yeah.
yeah, that I'll remember it in a second.
All right.
I'm totally blanking on it. That's a
That's all
great
right.
question. There's one I want everyone to read, but I'm forgetting it.
I'll put it in the show notes if we can
Absolutely, I'll
remember it.
tell
So
you.
anybody who made it this far, you're going to look in the show notes and see what's what. Well, Matt Hollingsworth, co-founder and CEO of Carta Healthcare, thanks for being my guest today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.